We're on the book of James, and we're in James chapter 3. And we got about halfway through this chapter last week. And, I was thinking how straightforward James was in the things that he said. Well, this chapter and the next chapter, you're going to see just how straightforward the Holy Spirit gave him the boldness to be. And but he begins chapter 3 by talking about not being many masters or not being many teachers. It would seem that there were many that wanted these positions because, like the Pharisees, they loved the title, they loved the prestige or whatever, the respect that people gave them for having these positions. And a lot of times people want to get up and talk about things that they don't really know anything about. And it can be a very dangerous thing. And James tells them, so listen, teachers are going to be under a microscope because they're not only living a certain way, but they're responsible for teaching people to live the right way and to do the right things. And so if you teach the wrong thing, as a teacher, you can be accountable to God for that. So he said, make sure that if you're going to teach, that you're called to teach, and you walk in the fear of God in all that you do. He then goes into talking about the tongue, and mainly the reason why he's transitioning into that is that teachers are up in front and they talk a lot, and that gives them more opportunity to say things that are out of line. But then he begins to warn all of us that we need to be careful with our speech. Remember, he said earlier in chapter 1, I believe it was, that we're all to be slow to speak and swift to hear. And so he talks about how difficult it is for us to control the tongue. Then he gets into verse 13, is where we're starting tonight. And in verse 13 he says, who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of a good conversation his works with meekness of wisdom. So if you're looking for somebody to follow, you're looking for somebody that's walking in divine wisdom, who has real knowledge, then that person, again, this goes back to the idea of teachers or masters. And he's saying that if you're wanting to find somebody who's really called of God or used of God in that way, then look for somebody that lives a life. When it says here, let him show out of a good conversation, conversation is their manner of life. Let him show out of their manner of life his works with meekness of wisdom. And we've talked about that word meekness. It's very closely associated with the idea of gentleness. And in fact, sometimes the words are translated interchangeably, sometimes gentleness and sometimes meekness. And so he was saying that somebody who's operating under divine wisdom, they have a meekness to their wisdom. They're not pushy, they're not overbearing, they're not lording it over people, but they have learned from God and learned from Christ that they're to walk in a gentleness of spirit. I've known men that through the years that I've respected so much, because not just because of what they knew, but the spirit in which they conveyed what they knew. I've known people that were absolutely brilliant to me in the things of God and knew so much, and yet they were able to express that with such a meekness, and they weren't overbearing in the way that they did things. And this is what James is talking about here, is that some of these teachers that were rising up, they only wanted the attention and they wanted to lord it over people, and they wanted everybody to serve them. And he said, listen, that's not the kind of wisdom that you should be following. Somebody that knows real wisdom and is operating in real wisdom, they're going to have a meekness to their life. He says in verse 14, but if ye have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not and lie not against the truth. This wisdom descendeth not from above, but is earthly, sensual, devilish. What he's saying here is that if you have in your heart the desire to make it above somebody else, and you're jealous of others, and you're bitter in your jealousy toward others, You see, if you're wanting to rise up in position, the temptation then would be to tear the people down that are in your way, to use them as a stepping stone, or to try and turn away people's affection and attention for that leader so that the affection and attention goes toward you. And so there could be some bitter envying and strife that goes along with this, where they're fighting about trying to gain that control and gain that position of authority and gain the respect. He says, but if that's what's driving you, you have that bitter jealousy and you're trying to gain your position by strife, by fighting and arguing. He says, don't glory in that, and don't lie against the truth. In other words, don't try and say that you're something that you're not, or try and pretend you're something you're not. That wisdom that you're operating under, that wisdom that wants to be overbearing, that wisdom that wants to put others down so you can build yourself up, he said that wisdom doesn't descend from above. That doesn't come from God. But that kind of wisdom is earthly. It's of this world. It's sensual. It's carnal. It's of the flesh. And he says, and it's devilish. Well, you think about it, the way the world, Jesus talked about this in leadership, made it, that's why he washed the disciples' feet, is to get them a right perspective on leadership. In the world, worldly wisdom tells you that, you climb to the top of the ladder and everybody serves you and it's all about you. He said that idea of trying to tear others down so you can rise to a position of respect and authority, he said that's worldly type of actions. That's not the kind of actions, that's not the servant attitude of somebody who's trying to do the things of God. He says that wisdom is earthly, it's sensual, it's carnal. See, the flesh wants what the flesh wants. It's self-seeking. It's self-centered. Somebody who's going to be in a position of leadership has to be a servant. They have to prefer their brother. They have to put others above themselves and try and do what's best for others. So this idea of I'm trying to climb the ladder so that you can serve me, so that's not of heaven, that's of this world. That's not of the spirit, that's of the flesh. And he says, and really, he said that attitude of trying to strive to get to the top, he said it's devilish. And the reason why he says it's devilish is that kind of bitter envying and jealousy and strife is exactly what the devil did to try and gain his position. He said, I will ascend above the stars. I'll be like the Most High God. And so you're in the same spirit of the devil if you're trying to gain your position or to gain preeminence. John talks about one man that one loved to have the preeminence among the brethren. He said, if you're trying to do that and you're envying and you have bitterness toward those that are in your way and you're fighting to gain that position, he said, then that's the same spirit of the devil. It's devilish. Again, he's contrasting earthly wisdom with heavenly wisdom, and somebody that you want to follow and somebody you don't want to follow. Somebody you should respect, somebody you shouldn't. And it's like somebody said one time that it's the greasy wheel it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. Somebody that is always, pushing themselves. A lot of times they're the ones that gets the attention, when in reality it should be that person that you want to, that has that kind of non-pushy, non-striving, you respect their manner of life. You see this, James is the one writing this, and this is James that in Acts 15, after everybody had spoken, he said, now here's what my sentence is. And everybody stopped and listened to James. And the reason they listened to James was because he was this type of person. That he wasn't this person of strife and bitter envying, but it was like, the old, that old stock market commercial, that stockbroker commercial, when E.F. Hutton speaks, people listen. James was like that. He had such a meekness of wisdom about his life that when he spoke, people wanted to hear what he had to say. I've mentioned before one of my favorite Chinese proverbs. Not that I know a lot of Chinese proverbs, but this Chinese proverb I heard one time said, "He that thinks he leads and no one follows is only taking a walk." And so if you're there and you're pushing yourself out to the front, but nobody wants to hear what you have to say, then you're not accomplishing anything. James, on the other hand, was telling us, look for those leaders that are not trying to push themselves, but they're trying to gently tell you the things of God. And he's going to talk about this for a few verses. For where envying and strife is, there is confusion, there's chaos, and every evil work. When you get into a situation where people are operating under jealousy and they're fussing and fighting, he says all of that is going to lead to all kinds of other things. You know, jealousy has led people to murder people. You know, all of this chaos comes when you're operating out of strife and jealousy. And so he's telling them, don't let that be any part of who you are or how the church operates. We don't operate under this system of trying to push others down to push ourselves up. And so he says in verse 17, but the wisdom that is from above. Now you remember earlier he said that a person who has bitter envying and strife, he said that wisdom doesn't come from above. That comes from the earth and comes from carnality, and that comes from the devil. But he says, but the wisdom that is from above has certain attributes you can look for. If somebody's operating and displaying divine wisdom, it's first there's a purity to their life. You know, I want to know that a person, as Brother Philip said years ago, and even in the former fellowship, I heard him say at the assembly one year, he was speaking, and he said people will watch people preach over the internet, and they'll send their tithes and give their offerings and listen to everything they say, and they know nothing about that person. Know nothing about their life. He says, so if you're looking for somebody that's operating in divine wisdom, look to see whether or not they're living a pure life. Are they living a life of moral cleanness? He says that kind of holiness you're looking for. Then he says they're peaceable. And what that means is they're the kind of person that's, remember what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the peacemakers. They want peace. They're not looking for strife. They're not looking to argue. You know? In fact, the Apostle Paul writes, he says, if you're in a discussion with somebody and after the second or third admonition, they're still not accepting, he says, then reject them and move on. Because the last thing you want to do is to get into that. He says in another place, the servant of the Lord must not strive. There can't be that argumentative spirit. They're looking for peace. They're gentle. They have that gentleness about them that I'm not trying to hurt anybody, and it comes across that way. You look at Jesus' life. The Bible says it describes him this way. It says, a smoking flax he will not quench, and a bruised reed he will not break. You know, it's like he's so gentle, it's like if you've ever seen a plant that's been bent over and it's bruised. You can tell there's a weakness there now. And with just a little bit of pressure, it'll snap. It'll break. And so, but it was saying of Jesus that he's so gentle that even when the fire looks like it's almost to go out, he's so gentle he won't let it go out. When there's a bruised reed, he won't even break it because he's so gentle with them. There was a gentleness about Jesus that the sinners even appreciated. They wanted to hear what he had to say because even in telling them what they were doing was wrong, there was a gentleness to his spirit. And he says that's the kind of wisdom that comes from above. It's easy to be entreated. In other words, it's not got a stubborn spirit about it when you're going to talk to them. I don't care what you have to say. You know, I've made up my mind. Or I've talked about meekness and the fact of being easily approachable. Somebody who's displaying heavenly wisdom, you can talk to them, you can correct them, you can instruct them, because even when you're correcting them, even when you're reproving them, even when you're rebuking them, they just take it all because all of it, if it's right, it's going to help them get where they're needing to be. So it's easy to be entreated. It's full of mercy or compassion and full of good fruits. You see the good fruits in their life. You see the acts of compassion in their life. And in my mind, I see all of that goes together. We say, well, a teacher just instructs. Well, again, if the person doesn't have a spirit that people want to listen to or or that they want to hear what they have to say, then it doesn't matter how much they speak. So there needs to be good fruits in their life, and there needs to be mercy and compassion in their life. That's the kind of wisdom we're looking for. Without partiality and without hypocrisy. You know, earlier he talked about being a respecter of persons, and I think that's what he's talking about here with without partiality. In other words, he doesn't treat people different. That wisdom from above, it loves everybody the same. And it tries to treat everybody in the same way. And there's no hypocrisy in them. They are what they are all the time, everywhere, wherever they go. That's the kind of wisdom that comes from above. It shows no partiality, there's no hypocrisy, there's purity to it, there's gentleness to it. They're full of mercy, they're full of good fruits, they're gentle, they don't want to argue, they're not argumentative, but they're seeking to live a peaceful life. And it says, he backs this up in verse 18 saying, and the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. And what I read different commentators talking about this, but what I honestly believe he's saying here is that somebody who is sowing the gospel seed that produces the fruit of righteousness does so as peaceably as they can. They're not trying to